Hello, my name is Ceceilia Parnther. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Administrative and Instructional Leadership at St. John's. Thank you so much for joining me for Beyond Trauma, honoring the experiences of diverse populations in educational research and leadership.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the School of Education, the Department of Administrative and Instructional Leadership, our presenters, coordinators, and so many who have made this a wonderful event today. I'd also like to thank you for engaging in this work with me. Today I have 3 takeaways, and so for about the next 15 minutes, we are going to discuss considerations for racial equity as it relates to educational leadership and research. The intent is to offer you words that might be useful in your leadership and research practices related to racial equity, no matter where you might be on that journey. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging who we are. And so you'll see the bullets indicate how multifaceted we are. And at any given time, we are called upon to make meaning of complex situations, specifically regarding equity and regarding culture. Too often, we have to spend our time demonstrating a return on investment, measuring effectiveness. And make no mistake, we want to be effective. But far too often in doing that, we dismiss some of the issues that further traumatize our students and our research participants. Rather than challenging the standards and measures, we often contort ourselves to fit. And so when we consider the transformational, especially as it relates to equity, how do we reframe the narrative? I thought it might be fun to show who I am. So me, 9-year-old me, using personal experience often helps to frame this discussion. And so as a child, I was a student who raised my hand too much. I was too talkative, too passionate, often misunderstood, and more often than not doubted. I asked for help with difficult situations and was often presumed incompetent. And I watched as skills that I was punished for be celebrated as leadership qualities in others. So I learned to be less loud. I learned to speak when spoken to. I learned to offer help, but not expect it. I learned to participate, but not too much. I remembered how to make myself small, how to make myself appropriate. I sat for hours on end to straighten what was deemed unruly hair. This worked for many years until it didn't, because I understood that my identity is not traumatic. My personhood is not traumatic. I am the benefactor of parents who sacrificed everything they could to make sure that I had a better quality of life than they may have been accustomed to. I was celebrated and nurtured by mentors who saw me as more than a risk factor or analysis. And for this reason, I dedicate my career to student success, support, and educational equity. I found this quote that was really meaningful to me because it isn't about how you look, but it is about how individuals assign meanings to how you look. And I share who I am because these are things that are unchanging. These are characteristics that will always be a part of me. And so our willingness to open minds despite race is necessary. We may not be complacent, especially in education. I want to share a bit about my research. I look at education as a trust contract. And when it works well. We believe that education is a gateway to social mobility. But there are times and there are issues where we realize that those things don't quite happen. To my left, you'll see at the top the Baltimore City Public School building, where just last week, a student who received a 0.13 GPA was touted as being in the top half of his class. In a different scenario, just about 30 miles away, over 20 years ago, we have a student at the top of his class, but upon applying to colleges realizes that his education has not met the standard of his applications. Now, while he was deemed successful and was incredibly resilient, we recognize that this is the exception and not the rule. In the center, you'll see Carl Bringham's A Study of American Intelligence. A supporter of eugenics, Carl Brigham created the Army Skills Test and suggested that integration, racial mixing would be the detriment of our educational system. That test is today's SAT. Further to your right, you'll see a camera, which represents the increased surveillance that is happening all over education. What is interesting is that as we've increased diversity and increased access, we have desired additional social controls, and this is one way that we do them. And lastly, there is an illustration depicting happiness at the Brown versus Board of Ed decision that, of course, we're all familiar with. And despite this, we remain in largely segregated schools, largely due to our own decision-making. So what do we do? There are those of us who stand up in defiance, who stand up and say that enough is enough, and we've seen these things. I'm reminded of Claudette Colvin, who at 15 and 9 months before Rosa Parks boycotted. She did not get up when she was asked to, and as a result, she became a plaintiff in the landmark Browder v. Gale case. That case found that bus segregation was indeed unconstitutional. She chose to act because the adults around her were complacent. And so while we appreciate this, we recognize that there is more that we need to do. Also interesting in this case is Ms. Colvin's recognition that she didn't seem to fit the part. When we think about how we promote equity and we put our best face forward, she was deemed unsatisfactory. Imagine, if you will, being limited in your ability to advocate, being gatekept because of the way that you look, of your age, and recognize that this continues to happen the more and more we follow certain norms. Specifically, Ms. Colvin described Rosa Parks as being someone who had the right hair and the right look. Despite that threat to her personhood, she held steadfast to what she believed in. So why does all of this matter? It matters because in research and leadership, we are used to framing norms through a racial frame. And Fegan in 2013 described this white racial framing as a way that we understand what we value to be true, to be normal, those narratives, interpretations, and prejudices and stereotypes that guide our way of thinking. Do I mean that to say that we intentionally discriminate, that this is born out of hatred? Absolutely not. But it begs the question, if we harbor these beliefs collectively and we're never challenged on those beliefs, then everything that seems non-normative remains non-normative. We cannot make changes or challenge what is true or normal or our values because we've already decided that we will live within these norms and frames. So what can we do? In our research and leadership, we can be direct and explicit regarding who we aim to serve, what the missions of our programs are, and the nuances that also occur between and within groups. We can focus on the ethics of what it means to serve specific groups and recognize that by asking them to participate in our research and interventions, we are asking them to make sacrifices. And to that end, we must remain accountable. We must surround ourselves by individuals who are willing to support us in a journey to better understanding. And lastly, we must think through, but not depend on history to provide that guidance. This doesn't mean that everyone is a critical theorist, but it certainly means that sometimes the narrative needs to expand to include the nuance and systemic issues that impact so many communities. But we are moving beyond trauma. Our aim is to focus on something bigger, which is also to celebrate that diversity, that culture, and the opportunities to expand our worldview. Failing to do that, we lend ourselves to extreme consequences. Implicit bias is often used to frame minority students as somehow incompetent, somehow disproportionate in their success or ability to achieve. And we see these statistics being used. When we think about racial statistics and eugenics, there are often very, very precarious lines, and we must be mindful of what it means when whiteness is always normative. It's easy to believe that that is only because of the numbers and population, but taking a closer look at the historic origins of these issues, we must reconcile the fact that these things historically were used to divide and not to unify. So what does that mean for our research and design? It doesn't mean that we aren't using the tools that are available to us, but it does mean that we should consider time and access. We need to challenge ourselves to think beyond the leadership theories in front of us and put things into context, to challenge those things, to read those researchers who offer nuance and to celebrate them, to have diversity in our citing practices and to expect the same from others, to hold ourselves and our colleagues accountable, to reconsider our definitions of rigor, of evidence and validity, so that we are adding on, in protection and in honor of our participants' experiences. And also recognizing where we place the value of our population. What does it mean to truly center them? What does it mean to celebrate what they bring to the table and also honor their experiences regardless of the outcome or finding? Before closing, I want to share something that applies both in research, in leadership, and in life. And this is advice from my mom. When you are invited to a table, you always begin with respect. Invited to a home, you take your shoes off. You don't bring your dirt inside. You always bring a gift, a token of appreciation. This doesn't have to be monetary, but it should be meaningful. Be willing to accept what is served, even if it is something you aren't used to. And always offer to leave the door open for opportunities to collaborate and connect. Your participants, your communities, your schools, they give and they sacrifice pieces of themselves to be understood. And these are ways that we can continue to honor them. And I will close with a call to action. This begins now. As you're thinking about looking at different research presentations today, think about the care that went into designing these studies. The intentionality, even within secondary research studies where individuals are far removed from the population. How is the population discussed? Do we move beyond trauma and challenge our own biases so that we can ask questions and learn more about culture and nuance? Do we hold ourselves accountable and diversify relationships so that we can better understand another individual's experience? Are we committed to continuous learning? And of course you are. right? Or you wouldn't be here. But how are we demonstrating that in honor of the individuals that we so passionately serve? And how do we honor them in spite of all that systemically happens, in spite of all of the trauma and the sadness? How do we honor their victories, their freedoms, and their work toward liberation? How do we honor their culture? How do we honor their sacrifice? Thank you very much for your time. As you can see, I've listed my email, Twitter, and website. Feel free to contact me for additional information.
I hope that you enjoy the remainder of the symposium. Please feel free to reach out at any time. I'd love to continue the conversation. Thank you and take good care.